The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Jamal Williams stared at the page in front of him, the letters dancing and shifting like they always did. His heart pounded against his chest as Mrs. Rivera's voice cut through the silence of the sophomore English class. "Jamal, please read the next paragraph from To Kill a Mockingbird." The 15-year-old's palms grew sweaty as he gripped the edges of his worn paperback. From 2 rows behind, he could hear Brandon Thompson's signature snicker, followed by the subtle sound of a phone camera clicking on. Jamal knew what was coming. It was the same routine that had played out countless times before. At Atticus was fee-feeble. Jamal stumbled over the words, each one feeling like glass in his throat. The letters jumbled and swirled, mocking him with their chaos. He was nearly 50, Brandon stage whispered, earning scattered giggles from around the classroom. Mrs. Rivera shot him a half-hearted glare but did nothing more. "Take your time, Jamal," Mrs. Rivera said, her voice tinged with poorly hidden impatience. But Jamal could barely hear her over the blood rushing in his ears. At home that night, Jamal sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by textbooks and worksheets. The clock read 11:43 p.m. when his mother, Dr. Williams, finally walked through the door, still in her blue hospital scrubs from her double shift at Metro General. "Baby, you're still up?" She dropped her keys in the bowl by the door, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "You should be in bed." "I'm trying to finish my homework, Mom." Jamal quickly covered the crumpled English assignment marked with a glaring D at the top. "You know I can help you if you need it," she said, but they both knew it was an empty offer. Between her 60-hour work weeks and catching up on sleep, there was barely time for conversations, let alone tutoring sessions. The next day started like any other, but Jamal could sense something was different the moment he walked into school. The whispers were louder, the stares more obvious, and the laughs more pointed. When he reached his locker, he saw Tyler Ross, Brandon's faithful sidekick, waiting with a smirk that spelled trouble. "Hey, genius," Tyler called out, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Your video's going viral. You're famous." Jamal's stomach dropped as Tyler held up his phone. There on the screen was yesterday's English class performance, but this version had been edited. Superimposed text read "World's Dumbest Student," while laugh tracks and cartoon sound effects punctuated each of his struggles. The view counter already showed over 2,000 views. The entire school had seen it. Brandon appeared behind Tyler, his 6-foot frame towering over Jamal. "What's wrong, Williams? Can't read the view count?" "Here, let me help you sound it out. TT2000. His impression of Jamal's stutter earned roaring laughter from the growing audience. The day deteriorated from there. In physics, someone had taped a warning, "Brain not found," sign to his chair. During lunch, his regular table was occupied by seniors who pointed and laughed when he walked by, forcing him to eat in a bathroom stall. Even in math, his best subject, he couldn't escape the whispers and snickering. After school, Jamal made his way to Principal Hayes's office, clutching a printout of the video's comments section filled with cruel remarks. The principal, a tall man with graying temples and perpetually tired eyes, barely looked up from his computer. "Mr. Williams, unless you have concrete evidence of who posted this video, there's little I can do. Besides, it's just harmless teenage fun. Perhaps if you applied yourself more in class." Jamal's throat tightened. "But sir, Brandon Thompson and Tyler Ross are both honor roll students with exemplary records," Principal Hayes interrupted. "I suggest you focus on improving your own academic performance rather than making accusations." That evening, Dr. Williams was once again absent, called in for an emergency surgery. Alone in his room, Jamal finally allowed himself to break down. Tears fell onto his physics homework, the only subject where numbers made perfect sense, where his mind seemed to work differently, better even. But nobody saw that. They only saw what he couldn't do, never what he could. His phone buzzed with notifications from a group chat he'd been added to, Special Ed Entertainment, where classmates were sharing more edited versions of the video. Some had added cartoon effects, others had remixed his stuttering into mock rap songs. Brandon's latest comment read, "Tomorrow's gonna be epic. Wait till everyone sees what we have planned for English class." Jamal curled up on his bed, his mind racing with tomorrow's possibilities. The thought of walking back into that school made him physically ill. He grabbed his phone, fingers hovering over his mother's number, but stopped. She was in surgery, saving someone's life. His problems could wait. They always did. As he lay there, staring at his ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars formed constellations he could name by heart, Jamal remembered something his mother always said: "Your struggles don't define you, how you overcome them does." But right now, overcome felt like a mountain too high to climb, a word too complex to read, a future too dim to see. The video's view count hit 5,000 by midnight. Jamal didn't sleep at all, watching the numbers climb higher and higher, much like the walls closing in around him. Tomorrow was another day, another battle, another chance for Brandon and his crew to remind everyone that Jamal Williams was the dumbest kid at Hamilton High. Little did they know, this breaking point would become his turning point. Sometimes, when you hit rock bottom, the only way left is up, especially when you have a gift the world hasn't discovered yet. The morning after the viral video incident, Jamal slipped into Mrs. Patterson's physics classroom 15 minutes before first bell. The aging classroom smelled of chalk dust and coffee, and the early morning sun painted golden rectangles on the scuffed linoleum floor. He chose this time carefully, too early for Brandon and his crew, who usually swaggered in seconds before the bell. Mrs. Patterson looked up from her lesson plans, her silver-rimmed glasses catching the light. "Jamal? You're here early." He stood awkwardly by her desk, gripping his worn backpack. "Mrs. Patterson, I was wondering if I could switch seats. Maybe to the front." His voice cracked slightly. It's harder to focus in the back." She studied him for a moment, her eyes softening with understanding. She'd seen the video, everyone had, but unlike her colleagues, she'd noticed something else about Jamal Williams, something that didn't add up with the dumb kid's narrative. "Actually, Jamal, I wanted to discuss yesterday's quiz with you." She pulled out a paper from her desk drawer. Unlike his other assignments, this one was covered in red circles rather than crosses. "Do you realize you solved the advanced momentum problems without showing any work?" Jamal shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sorry. I know we're supposed to show our steps, but the answers just come to me. Like they're already there in my head." Mrs. Patterson leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Jamal, these aren't just correct answers. You solved university-level physics problems in your head. Problems that most students need calculators and multiple steps to figure out." She pulled out another sheet, a set of complex equations that made calculus look like basic arithmetic. "Can you tell me what you see?" Jamal's eyes scanned the page, and suddenly the numbers began dancing, not like the confusing letter jumble he was used to, but in a beautiful, orchestrated symphony. "The solution is 4.38 times 10 to the power of negative 27 joules, he said without hesitation. "But you already knew that, didn't you?" Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened. "That took me 20 minutes to solve last night." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Jamal, have you ever heard of hypercalculia?" Over the next hour, as the classroom filled and emptied with other students, Mrs. Patterson explained what she'd suspected for weeks. Hypercalculia, an extremely rare condition where the brain possesses extraordinary mathematical and computational abilities. While Jamal struggled with reading due to his undiagnosed dyslexia, his mind was performing complex calculations at a level that most physicists would envy. "But if I'm so smart," Jamal whispered, his voice bitter, "why can't I read like everyone else?" "Einstein couldn't tie his shoelaces until he was 9, Mrs. Patterson replied with a gentle smile. "Being different doesn't mean being less. Sometimes, it means being extraordinary." That conversation marked the beginning of a transformation. Mrs. Patterson arranged to meet Jamal every day after school, turning her classroom into a sanctuary where his gift could flourish. While the viral video continued to circulate, Jamal immersed himself in a world of quantum mechanics and theoretical physics. Dr. Williams noticed the change in her son during one of her rare evenings off. She found him at the kitchen table, surrounded not by struggling English homework, but by advanced physics textbooks and pages of complex calculations. "Baby, what's all this?" she asked, picking up a paper filled with equations she barely understood despite her medical degree. "Mom, I need to show you something." For the first time in years, Jamal's voice held excitement rather than shame. He explained everything: the dyslexia, the hypercalculia, Mrs. Patterson's discovery. As he spoke, tears formed in his mother's eyes. "All this time," she whispered, "I thought you weren't trying hard enough. I should have seen it. I should have been here more." "You were saving lives, Mom," Jamal said softly. "Now it's my turn to make a difference." Word of Jamal's mathematical abilities began to spread among the faculty. In his other classes, teachers finally recognized his dyslexia wasn't laziness and began providing proper accommodations. He received audio versions of textbooks and extra time for reading assignments. His grades started improving, not because he had suddenly learned to read better, but because people finally understood how his mind worked differently. Brandon, however, wasn't about to let Jamal's reputation change so easily. "Look at special ed," he sneered one day in the cafeteria, pretending to be Good Will Hunting. "Bet he can't even spell it." But this time, something was different. When Brandon grabbed Jamal's physics notebook to mock his calculations, he found himself staring at equations that might as well have been written in ancient Sanskrit. Tyler, looking over Brandon's shoulder, furrowed his brow in confusion. "Dude," Tyler muttered, "what even is this?" Before Brandon could respond, Mrs. Patterson appeared. "That, Mr. Ross, is a original proof of quantum entanglement that would impress researchers at MIT. Perhaps you'd like to explain it to the class?" Brandon's face reddened as he dropped the notebook. For the first time, the bully looked small, confronted by something he couldn't understand or mock. As winter turned to spring, Jamal's gift continued to develop. He started solving problems that had stumped physicists for years. Mrs. Patterson connected him with university professors who were astounded by his abilities. His mother rearranged her hospital shifts to attend his presentations and demonstrations. One evening, as they worked late in her classroom, Mrs. Patterson handed Jamal a brochure. "The state science competition," she said, trying to contain her excitement. "The winner gets a full scholarship to MIT." Jamal stared at the brochure, his heart racing. But Brandon's already registered. His father's on the Board of Education. Mrs. Patterson smiled, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "Then perhaps it's time to show everyone exactly what you can do." As Jamal walked home that night, clutching the competition brochure, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. The same stars he'd memorized on his ceiling now shone above him in the real sky, reminding him that sometimes the most brilliant lights emerge from the darkest places. Little did Brandon know his reign of terror was about to come to a spectacular end. The stage was set for a showdown that would change everything, not just for Jamal, but for every kid who'd ever been labeled, dismissed, or underestimated. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony. And justice was about to be served with a side of quantum physics. The state science competition buzzed with nervous energy as hundreds of students set up their presentations in the massive convention center. Jamal stood before his booth, surrounded by complex equations and quantum physics models that had taken months to perfect. His mother had taken the day off, her first in 3 years, and stood nearby, beaming with pride. Brandon's booth, directly across the aisle, featured a flashy display about solar energy. His father, a board member, had spared no expense on professional graphics and cutting-edge technology. Brandon kept shooting smug looks in Jamal's direction, especially when judges passed by. "Nice kindergarten drawings," Brandon whispered during a quiet moment, gesturing to Jamal's hand-drawn quantum diagrams. "Did you need help holding the crayon?" Jamal didn't respond. His mind was focused on the presentation to come, running through calculations that could revolutionize our understanding of quantum entanglement. Mrs. Patterson had helped him prepare for weeks, spending countless hours after school perfecting his delivery. The preliminary judging began. Brandon's rehearsed speech about solar efficiency drew polite applause. His father stood in the back, phone in hand, already drafting a congratulatory social media post. But when the judges reached Jamal's booth, something extraordinary happened. As Jamal began explaining his theory, the judges' expressions shifted from routine interest to astonishment. A professor from MIT leaned forward, scribbling furiously in his notebook. Another judge, a renowned physicist, interrupted with increasingly complex questions, which Jamal answered with natural ease. "This is unprecedented," the MIT professor muttered, examining Jamal's equations. "You've identified a pattern in quantum entanglement that could revolutionize quantum computing?" A crowd began gathering. Brandon watched in disbelief as his audience dwindled, drawn to the growing excitement at Jamal's booth. His father stopped typing mid-post. Then came the final presentations. The top 3 contestants would present their projects to the entire convention. Brandon's name was called first, a courtesy to his father, everyone knew. He delivered his rehearsed speech, but the judges seemed distracted, still discussing Jamal's equations among themselves. Just before Jamal's presentation, however, disaster struck. His laptop, containing his simulation models, wouldn't turn on. As he checked the connections, he found the power cord had been cut, clean, deliberate marks that couldn't be accidental. But years of relying on his mind rather than technology had prepared him for this moment. "I don't need the simulations," Jamal announced, stepping onto the stage. "I'll draw them as I explain." What followed was nothing short of magical. For 45 minutes, Jamal commanded the attention of every person in the convention center. His hands flew across the whiteboard, creating complex diagrams and equations from memory. He explained quantum mechanics with such clarity that even non-scientists could grasp the concepts. When he demonstrated how his theory could double the efficiency of quantum computers, the MIT professor stood up and applauded. In the back of the hall, security cameras had captured everything, including Brandon slipping behind Jamal's booth earlier, wire cutters in hand. Principal Hayes, who had come to support Brandon, watched the footage in his office later with a mix of shame and shock. The awards ceremony was a formality. Jamal won first place by unanimous decision. The scholarship to MIT was accompanied by offers for advanced research positions and a special commendation from the Department of Energy. Dr. Williams cried as she hugged her son, whispering, "Your struggles didn't define you. Your brilliance did." Brandon's fall from grace was swift and complete. The sabotage footage leaked, going viral just like his bullying video had months before. His early acceptance to Princeton was revoked. His father resigned from the Board of Education to avoid a scandal. Tyler, seeing the consequences of years of cruelty, approached Jamal to apologize. 1 week later, Jamal stood in Mrs. Patterson's classroom one last time. MIT had offered to let him start early in their advanced physics program. "You knew all along, didn't you?" he asked her. "That I wasn't stupid? I knew you were different," she smiled, "and different often means extraordinary." The story of the dyslexic boy who revolutionized quantum physics went viral, but this time, Jamal controlled the narrative. He started a foundation for students with learning differences, emphasizing that every mind has unique gifts. His first grant went to Hamilton High School, funding a comprehensive learning support program. Brandon, required to complete community service for the sabotage attempt, was assigned to tutor elementary school students with dyslexia. It was a fitting reminder that intelligence comes in many forms, and that everyone deserves the chance to shine in their own way. As Jamal packed for MIT that summer, he found his old To Kill a Mockingbird copy. The letters still danced on the page, but they no longer held any power over him. He was more than his struggles, more than the viral video, more than anyone's expectations. He was living proof that sometimes the greatest minds don't think alike. They think extraordinarily. The glow-in-the-dark stars still shone on his bedroom ceiling, but now they reminded him not of sleepless nights filled with anxiety, but of infinite possibilities. In the vast universe of human potential, he had found his place among the stars. And somewhere in that same universe, equations danced through his mind, unlocking secrets that would change the world. Proof that sometimes the most brilliant light comes from those who were once told they could only know darkness.